The wind cuts across the Norwegian plateau at 30 degrees below zero. Snow piles against the thick turf walls of the longhouse as the sun vanishes for the final time in December. Inside the structure, a family sleeps on raised wooden benches wrapped in wool and animal fur. The fire in the central pit has died to embers, yet the hall remains warm. This was not achieved by luck. It was the result of a sophisticated understanding of physics that kept them alive through the extreme cold. Between the years 793 and 1066, these Scandinavian settlers built rectangular halls across the north. The size of these buildings reflected the wealth of the family, stretching up to 75 meters in length. But regardless of the length or the status of the owner, the width remained remarkably consistent between 5 and 7 meters. This was not an arbitrary choice. The width determined the thermal performance of the entire home. A narrow structure meant less surface area through which heat could escape relative to the volume of air inside. It also ensured that warmth from a single central hearth could reach the outer walls evenly. Length could be adjusted for status, but width was fixed by the physics of heat retention. The Viking builders had no formal training in thermodynamics, yet they standardized the one dimension that mattered most for their survival. The longhouse functioned as a complete survival system rather than just a simple shelter. It was a machine designed to capture, store and distribute heat through the coldest months of the year using only stone, earth, wood and fire. The first challenge was the exterior envelope. In a climate where temperatures could remain below freezing for months, the walls had to resist the relentless leaching of warmth. In areas like Iceland, where timber was scarce, builders relied on thick blocks of turf and sod to create the walls. The timber they did use was often treated by scorching to carbonize the outer layer, making it resistant to rot in the damp conditions. These turf walls were extremely thick and functioned as natural thermal blankets. Turf is filled with organic matter and trapped air which slows the conductive transfer of heat. Even more importantly, the sheer mass of the packed earth provided what engineers call thermal inertia. This is the resistance of a material to temperature change. A long house encased in tons of turf would take hours to cool down even as the external temperature plummeted. Without this thermal buffer, the interior would have lost heat as quickly as it was generated. Inside the longhouse, the floor was made of packed dirt and often layered with ash to absorb moisture and control odors. Running down the center of the hall was the central hearth known as the langgulda. This was the heart of the structure both literally and symbolically. The hearth was built using flat stones arranged carefully around the fire pit. During the short winter days, the fire burned steadily for cooking and warmth. The flames directly heated the stones, which had high thermal mass. These stones absorbed heat slowly, but once they were heated, they held that energy for a long time. As the fire burned, the stones reached temperatures significantly higher than the ambient air. They became a battery. At night, the fire was allowed to die down or was banked with ash to smolder gently, but the stones continued to radiate heat. This radiant warmth was steady and sufficient to keep the interior livable without requiring constant fuel. Families could sleep through the night without tending the fire, and they would wake to a hall that was still warm. Archaeological evidence shows that hearthstones were often worn smooth from centuries of repeated thermal stress. This system was efficient because it decoupled heat generation from heat delivery, but stone alone could not solve the problem of survival. The longhouse also had to manage the flow of air. There were no chimneys in these structures. Smoke escaped through an opening in the roof called the lieri. This opening was the only intentional vent aside from small gaps near the ridgeline called wind eyes, which is the origin of the modern word window. When the fire burned, the warm air rose naturally due to the stack effect. In the longhouse, the high ceiling allowed the smoke to rise and collect in a dense layer just beneath the roof. This smoke layer served a surprising purpose as insulation. It trapped the warmer and cleaner air below it where the family lived and worked. Heat rises, but if the rising heat is slowed by a dense layer of combustion gases, it cannot escape as quickly through the roof. The lieri allowed just enough smoke to exit to prevent the hall from becoming unbreathable, but not so much that the structure lost its warmth. This was controlled convection. The Vikings managed airflow with precision to create thermal zones within the building. The lower zone remained relatively warm and breathable while the upper zone acted as a thermal blanket. This design created a survival paradox. The same system that kept families warm through sub-zero winters also exposed them to health risks from smoke pollutants. Minimal ventilation was necessary to maintain the insulating smoke layer, but it also meant minimal dilution of combustion byproducts. Chronic exposure to these particles could cause respiratory damage over time. However, in a landscape where the cold could kill within hours, the smoke was simply the price of staying alive. Replacement air entered through vents underneath the hearth itself. Cold air drawn in at the level of the fire pit would be immediately heated by the flames. This fed the loop without introducing cold drafts into the living areas. It was advanced airflow management achieved without mechanical fans or ducts. The longhouse was also a biological system. Minajed but mamizin to be a rukis bubble. During the coldest months, livestock were often housed inside the structure. These animals generated constant metabolic heat from their own bodies. Animals are living radiators that do not require fuel beyond feed and water. Their heat is continuous and reliable. In the coldest hours of the night, the body heat of a dozen sheep or a pair of cattle could make the difference between a livable interior and a freezing one. The Vikings were incorporating animal metabolism into the thermal budget of the dwelling. Every source of heat mattered. Along the inner walls ran raised wooden platforms used for seating, storage, and sleeping. By sleeping above the floor, people avoided the coldest layer of air. Cold air is denser and sinks to the packed dirt floor. The raised benches placed sleepers in the warmest available air, directly in line with the radiant heat from the hearth and just below the insulating smoke layer. This was thermal zoning, where the middle layer of the hall was optimized for human comfort. As the solstice approached and the darkness deepened, this thermal machine became the only thing standing between the Norse family and the void of winter. The celebration of Jul was born from this struggle against the killing cold. The hearth served as the axis around which daily life revolved, marking the boundary between the controlled space of the hall and the chaos of the natural world outside. Warmth, light, and community existed on one side, while cold, darkness, and wilderness existed on the other. It was a time to honor the fire that refused to go out and the walls that held the darkness at bay. This seasonal ritual was more than just a feast. It was a desperate attempt to summon the sun back to a world that seemed to have forgotten the light. As the darkness reached its peak, the family inside the long house began the transition from mere survival to the spiritual defiance of the solstice. This month was known to the Vikings as the month of Jul. It was a time when the physical limitations of the North Atlantic landscape were most visible. In this world, the sun appeared as a pale and distant memory, barely skimming the horizon before vanishing behind the volcanic peaks. The Norse believed that during these nights, the veil between the world of the living and the world of the supernatural became thin. They saw the cold as an indifferent predator that attacked without malice. But Jul was the moment when they chose to fight back with the only weapons they possessed. They had fire, stone, earth, and wood. They also had the accumulated knowledge of generations who had refined the art of keeping the darkness at bay. The celebration was not a single evening of joy, but a 3-night period of intense ritual and community gathering. This was the turning of the wheel. The Vikings understood that they did not conquer winter, but rather accommodated it through intelligence and observation. The long house, stretching 30 meters across the landscape, was the center of this cultural defiance. Its massive walls, often over a meter thick, were stacked with blocks of turf that served as a thermal battery for the household. Inside the scaly or main hall, the air was heavy with the scent of livestock and smoke. The livestock kept in the foes at one end of the building provided a constant source of metabolic heat. A single cow could generate substantial warmth simply by existing, and a small herd contained within the heavily insulated envelope acted as a biological furnace for the humans sleeping just a few meters away. During Jul, the presence of these animals was more than a technical asset. It was a reminder of the life that remained in the world despite the frozen void outside. The centerpiece of the celebration was the ale. Brewing was not just a culinary task, but a legal and religious obligation for every farmer. The law of the land dictated that a certain amount of ale must be brewed for the midwinter feast, and failure to do so could result in fines or the loss of social standing. The barley was malted, and the liquid was fermented in large wooden vats. This ale was consecrated in the name of the gods. The first cup was offered to Odin, the Allfather, seeking victory and power in the coming year. The second cup was for Newd and Frey, the gods of fertility and plenty, asking for a good harvest and the survival of the livestock. For a people living on the edge of the habitable world, these toasts were not empty words. They were a contract with the forces of nature. They understood that their survival was a fragile gift stolen from the jaws of death every single day. The ale served as a liquid bridge between the human community and the divine powers that controlled the wind and the snow. As the cups were passed around the central hearth, the fire known as the Langelder was built larger than usual. The fuel demands were staggering, often requiring over 54 kilograms of birchwood daily during the winter months. In regions like Iceland, where forests were nearly absent, this use of wood represented a significant sacrifice of resources. Every branch and every log was a precious treasure harvested from driftwood or recycled from old structures. Burning a massive log for Joel was a display of wealth and confidence. It was a statement that the family had enough stored energy to waste a portion of it to honor the light. The stones around the fire pit, having absorbed the intense heat throughout the day, continued to radiate warmth long after the heavy drinking had ended. This radiant heat provided a stable interior environment, even as the wind howled across the black volcanic plains outside. The longhouse was uniquely suited for these communal gatherings because of its interior layout. The raised wooden platforms called palla allowed the family and their guests to sit above the coldest layer of air. While the floor might be freezing, the people sitting on the benches were positioned in a warmer microclimate directly in line with the radiant heat of the hearth. The smoke layer collected beneath the high roof acted as an insulating blanket, slowing the escape of heat through the Leori smoke hole. This stratification meant that even with a large crowd, the occupied zone remained relatively comfortable. The social structure of the Vikings was reinforced by this physical arrangement. The chieftain sat in his high seat, flanked by the carved pillars known as the Onve Sula. These pillars were inscribed with divine symbols and represented the connection between the family lineage and the land. During Joel, the chieftain was responsible for providing the feast. It was his duty to ensure that his followers and kin were fed and warm. This was the social contract of the North. Loyalty was traded for protection and the assurance that when the great winter came, there would be a place by the fire. But why was this specific time of year so terrifying to the Norse mind? Why did they feel the need to huddle so closely together and perform these elaborate rituals? The answer lies in the environment they inhabited. They saw the cold as a silent and invisible drain of heat that could kill without hesitation. The emptiness of the winter sky was like a vacuum always pulling at their life force. On a clear and cold night, the temperature could drop 20 degrees in a matter of hours as heat radiated into space. To the Vikings, this was not just a change in the weather, it was a cosmic battle. They believed that the darkness was home to entities that did not wish for the sun to return. The Joel feast was a way to generate a collective shield of warmth and light. It was a demonstration of human ingenuity and resilience in the face of an indifferent universe. They were farmers and artisans who had observed how heat moved and how smoke behaved, and they used that knowledge to create a space where life could persist. As the third night of the feast approached, the focus shifted from the gods to the ancestors and the spirits that shared their landscape. They were no longer just surviving the winter. They were inviting the future to begin. This invitation to the future was signed in the blood of the sonar blot. The Vikings understood that survival in a world of 30 degrees below zero temperatures was a holistic effort that combined the spiritual with the scientific. As the darkness reached its absolute peak, the chieftain would prepare the sacrifice of a boar to the god Frey to ensure the return of the sun and the fertility of the land. This ritual took place within the rectangular langus, a structure engineered with a consistent width of 5 to 7 meters to optimize the retention of heat. The narrow width of the hall was determined by the physics of thermal performance, ensuring that every participant in the ritual could feel the warmth from the central stone hearth. They gathered around the Langilda fire pit, which was the heart of the structure both literally and symbolically. The flat stones surrounding the fire were being stoked into a thermal battery, absorbing the slow and steady energy that would be needed to keep the hall livable through the long night. While the ritual blood was used to consecrate the hall, the meat was prepared to stoke the internal furnaces of the people. The Vikings knew that the human body is a furnace that must be fed with the right fuel to stay alive. Fat was the high-octane energy source of the north, and they consumed massive quantities of meat with a focus on the fattiest parts. They understood that protein alone was not enough to survive a winter where the cold was a predator attacking through conduction and radiation. By consuming the fat of the sacrifice, they were providing their bodies with the calories necessary to maintain a core temperature against the frozen void outside. This reliance on fat shaped their entire winter life, from the way they hunted to the way they celebrated Joel. They were not just eating for pleasure, they were making a calculated move in a deadly game of survival. The Longhouse reinforced this biological strategy through its architecture. The massive turf walls, often over a meter thick, served as a thermal blanket that prevented the metabolic heat of the humans and animals from escaping. Turf is filled with organic matter and trapped air, which slows down the conductive transfer of heat into the frozen earth. Because Iceland and Greenland lacked the towering pines of the mainland, the builders had turned to the frozen ground itself to create their walls. These walls provided thermal inertia, meaning the hall would take hours to cool down even if the fire were to die to embers. Inside, the air was stratified into thermal zones that protected the family during the feast. The smoke from the cooking fire rose to the high ceiling and collected in a dense layer. This smoke layer acted as an additional layer of insulation, trapping the warmer air below where the participants were gathered. The participants sat on raised wooden platforms called palla, which ran the length of the inner walls. This elevation was a critical piece of survival engineering because cold air is denser and sinks to the packed dirt floor. By sitting and sleeping on these platforms, the Vikings stayed in the warmest zone of the building, just below the smoke and directly in line with the radiant heat of the hearth. The livestock kept in the section of the hall called the furs added their own metabolic heat to the celebration. These animals were living radiators that produced continuous and reliable warmth without requiring extra fuel. The body heat of a dozen sheep or a pair of cattle could raise the interior temperature significantly, supplementing the fire that burned in the center of the hall. This was biothermal integration, a philosophy that viewed every living thing in the Longhouse as a component of a thermal machine. The fire itself was the axis around which the entire social and ritual life of Joel revolved. It represented order and the survival of life against the chaos of the natural world. The hearthstone held immense symbolic weight, marking the boundary between the community and the wilderness. As the night wore on, the fire would be banked with ash to smolder gently, but the stones would continue to release their stored energy. This radiant warmth was steady and low, sufficient to keep the interior warm while the family slept through the coldest hours of the night. They would wake to a hall that was still warm, a testament to a system that decoupled heat generation from heat delivery. This was the survival engine of the North, a synthesis of stone, earth and fire that allowed human life to persist in a landscape that showed no mercy. The Joel celebration was the moment when this engine was tested to its limits. It was a time to trust in the accumulated knowledge of generations and the thick walls of turf that had been built to last. But as the ritual sacrifice concluded and the feast began, the focus shifted from the metabolic warmth of the animal to the chemical warmth of the wood. The Vikings knew that a single log, if chosen correctly and managed with precision, could be the difference between a night of community and a night of frozen silence. They were about to engage in a technical dance with the wood itself, selecting the fuels that would power their midwinter victory. The selection of wood for the Joel log was a matter of life and death, because firewood could be incredibly scarce in the North Atlantic. In mainland Scandinavia, builders could rely on ample timber from oak and pine forests, but the settlers in Iceland and Greenland faced a landscape where trees grew sparsely. They became masters of woodcraft, understanding that different species offered different properties for their survival. Hardwoods like oak were prized because they burned slow and steady, producing a long-lasting bed of coals that provided overnight warmth. In the absence of such forests, the Vikings turned to birch or driftwood, treating every scrap of timber as a treasure. The Joel log was the most significant fuel source of the year, often selected months in advance for its size and density. This massive log was placed in the central hearth known as the Langelder, which was not just a fire pit but a sophisticated thermal battery. As the log burned with intense heat during the waking hours, the flat stones arranged beneath and around it absorbed the energy. Stone has a high thermal mass, meaning it absorbs heat slowly but holds it for a long duration. The fire directly heated these stones until they reached temperatures significantly higher than the ambient air inside the hall. This process effectively transformed the wood energy into stored radiant heat. The Vikings understood that heat moves in three primary ways which they managed with intuitive precision. First was radiation, the direct transfer of heat from the hot surface of the log and stones to the people sitting on the raised benches. By placing the hearth in the center of the hall, they ensured that heat radiated in all directions into the open space. This was more efficient than placing a fire against a wall where much of the energy would be lost to conduction through the exterior. Second was convection, the movement of heated air rising from the fire and circulating through the longhouse. The high ceiling allowed this warm air to spread throughout the volume of the building before it reached the insulating smoke layer. As the air cooled slightly near the walls, it would descend and flow back toward the center at floor level to be reheated. This created a natural circulation pattern that eliminated cold spots in the corners of the hall. Third was conduction, which the Vikings worked to minimize by building their homes with thick walls of earth and turf. They knew that sitting on a cold floor or leaning against a cold wall would act as a direct pipeline for their precious body heat to be sucked away. To combat this conductive loss, they lined their raised sleeping platforms with animal skins and furs which trapped pockets of insulating air. At night, as the Joel festivities moved toward rest, the fire was allowed to die down or was banked with ash to smolder gently. This was a critical step in their heat management strategy because it decoupled heat generation from heat delivery. The intense flames were needed only when the family was active and cooking, but the stored energy in the hearthstones carried the household through the coldest hours of the night without additional fuel consumption. Families could sleep through the darkest hours knowing that the stones would continue to radiate steady warmth into the living zone. This was thermal inertia in action, where the resistance of the stone and the surrounding turf walls to temperature change created a stable microclimate. The Vikings understood that an open fire in an uninsulated space would lose its heat instantly to the wind, but by wrapping their fire in earth and stone, they forced the soil itself to become a battery. The log also served as a source of light and a focal point for the social order of the longhouse. Because there were no windows to prevent heat from hemorrhaging through the walls, the interior was lit only by the glowing hearth. This darkness reinforced the symbolic importance of the fire as the axis around which the universe revolved. The chieftain sat in his high seat near the fire, which represented order and ancestral protection against the chaos of the winter void. The smoke from the Joel log rose toward the roof opening called the Leary, but before escaping, it collected in a dense layer just beneath the ceiling. This layer served a technical purpose as a thermal blanket, trapping warmer air below where the family gathered. The Vikings managed this airflow with precision, using the buoyancy of hot air to ensure the occupied zones remained relatively warm and breathable. Even on the most windless days, the chimney effect created by the Leary ensured that smoke exited while minimizing the loss of warmth. This system was not static but was constantly adjusted to match the changing conditions of the winter. A mountain man in a later era would describe this approach as a living layering system, and the Vikings applied the same logic to their dwellings. They added snow as an extra layer of insulation against the exterior walls, which further reduced the conductive loss of heat. They understood that the ground itself held heat, and they often sunk their homes partially into the earth to tap into its natural geothermal stability. Inside, they integrated biological heat from their livestock, which acted as living radiators, providing a continuous heat source that required no wood fuel. This biothermal integration was essential in a world where every kilogram of wood represented hours of labor. As the Joel logs slowly turned to coals, the ritual drinking of the ale began, marking the next phase of their battle against the darkness. This transition shifted the focus from the physical warmth of the hearth to the internal warmth of the community as they prepared to face the spiritual threats that lurked in the sub-zero night. The internal warmth of the community was reinforced by a legal and ritual obligation to brew ale. In the ancient Norse world, the midwinter feast was not a voluntary social gathering, but a mandated duty. The laws of the early Scandinavian kingdoms required every farmstead to brew a certain amount of ale specifically for the Joel period. This was a communal law that ensured everyone had access to the high-calorie liquid fuel needed to survive the darkest nights. Ale was the liquid battery of the Viking feast. It was brewed from barley and fermented into a beverage that was both spiritually significant and physically nourishing. The chieftain would take the first sip and offer it to Odin. This was a toast for victory and power. Then came the toast to Nud and Frey for peace and a good harvest. These toasts were offered around the central hearth, which was the axis around which all daily life revolved. The hearthstone marked the boundary between the controlled space of the hall and the chaos of the natural world outside. Warmth, light, and human community existed on one side, while cold, darkness, and wilderness existed on the other. The fire represented order and continuity. The hearth was not just a fire pit. It was where food was prepared and tools were forged. In larger longhouses, multiple hearth rooms often existed to accommodate the needs of a large community. One hearth near the entrance was used for daily cooking, while another set deeper in the structure was reserved for ritual purposes. During the midwinter feast, these fires burned with a fierce intensity to keep the hall warm against the -30-degree temperatures. But this intense fire came with a severe trade-off. Researchers have discovered that the longhouse design optimized for heat retention also trapped dangerous combustion byproducts. Near the fireplace, carbon monoxide concentrations could reach dangerous levels. Fine particulate matter also filled the air, posing a risk for respiratory damage. The Vikings were caught in a survival paradox. They had to endure the smoke or freeze. Minimal ventilation was necessary to maintain the insulating smoke layer and prevent rapid heat loss. In the context of a Scandinavian winter, the smoke was simply the price of staying alive. The longhouse was a synthesis of solutions where each element reinforced the others. The turf envelope provided insulation and thermal inertia. The stone hearth converted combustion into stored radiant heat. The high ceiling and smoke hole created controlled convection. The raised platforms kept the family in the warmest air. Even the livestock provided biological heat. If any one of these elements were removed, the entire system would fail. The longhouse was not optimized for a single function, but for the entire range of conditions a family would face. In summer, the thick walls kept the interior cool, while in winter they retained warmth. During the Joel feast, the hall became a place where the family celebrated sufficiency rather than luxury. The goal was not to create warmth indistinguishable from summer, but to generate enough heat to survive the night. The fire did not need to burn all day, and the air did not need to be completely smoke-free. The structure simply needed to work. Across Scandinavia and Iceland, families slept warm because someone realized that stone holds heat and turf slows heat loss. To power the biological furnaces of the people sitting around the hearth, the Vikings relied on fat as their primary fuel. Fat was the high-octane energy source of the north. They consumed massive quantities of meat, including tongue, liver, and bone marrow. They even considered beaver tail to be a delicacy because it was almost pure fat. They knew about the danger of rabbit starvation, where a person could starve on a diet of lean meat because the body requires fat to properly metabolize protein. Without fat, a slow and agonizing death was certain even with a full belly. A single person might consume between 5,000 and 6,000 calories a day to maintain their core body temperature. Much of this energy came from pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, rendered fat and berries. A single pound of pemmican contained over 3,000 calories and could sustain a person for days. This concentrated food was stored in the longhouse, hung from rafters or kept in pits lined with bark. The chieftain stood at the center of this social and thermal architecture. He was the one who provided the meat and the ale that fueled the community. In the larger halls, the size of the structure reflected the wealth and power of the leader. Some excavated halls measured over 40 meters in length, but even in these grand structures, the physics of heat remained the same. The width was kept narrow to ensure the heat from the hearth could reach everyone. The chieftain sitting in the high seat was surrounded by his warriors and kin. They were all bound together by the heat of the fire and the shared necessity of survival. As the toasts were offered, the community was reinforced. They were not just individuals fighting the cold. They were a collective unit that had integrated their architecture, their biology, and their social order into a single machine. The ale flowed and the fatty meats were passed around, providing the chemical energy to keep their internal fires burning. This was the peace and plenty they prayed for. Not the absence of cold, but the presence of enough resources to face it together. The presence of the animals in the foes added to the sensory experience of the Joel feast. Cattle and goats generate a constant metabolic heat between 37 and 39 degrees Celsius. In the confined space of the longhouse, this biological warmth supplemented the output of the central hearth. Animals are living radiators that require no fuel beyond feed and water. Their heat is continuous and reliable. In the coldest hours of the night, when the fire had burned down and the stones were releasing their last reserves of energy, the body heat of a dozen sheep could make the difference between a livable interior and a freezing one. The Vikings were not simply cohabiting with their animals for convenience, they were incorporating animal metabolism into the thermal budget of the dwelling. Every source of heat mattered and none was wasted. As the celebration continued into the night, the focus moved from the living inhabitants of the hall to the spectral dangers that waited outside in the storm. The supernatural fear that gripped the Norse mind during the midwinter solstice was rooted in the Oscaria or the wild hunt. They believed that on these longest and darkest nights, a spectral army of the dead led by Odin himself rode across the sky on ghostly horses. This was not a story told for entertainment around a fire, but a terrifying reality that dictated how they secured their homes and their livestock. The wind howling across the black volcanic plains was not seen merely as a meteorological event, but as the literal sound of the spirits passing overhead. In this environment, the longhouse was more than a thermal machine. It was a consecrated fortress designed to hold back the chaos of the supernatural world. The hearth sat at the center as the symbolic axis that anchored the family to the realm of the living. Beyond the thick turf walls, the cold was viewed as an indifferent predator that would kill without hesitation if a person made a single mistake. Inside the structure, the family listened to the storm through the small vents near the roof ridge known as wind eyes. These openings were the only source of light and ventilation, but they also acted as a gateway for the sounds of the wilderness. The Vikings understood that survival required a balance between isolation and ventilation. If they sealed the home too tightly, the smoke from the central hearth would become unbreathable. But if they opened the vents too wide, the precious heat would vanish into the sub-zero air. They managed this through controlled convection, utilizing the physical properties of hot and cold air to create a stable microclimate. The smoke gathered in a thick layer just beneath the ceiling, serving as an insulating thermal blanket that trapped the warmth below where the people lived and worked. This stratification meant that the family lived in a world of perpetual haze and dim firelight. This darkness fed the belief that the dead returned to visit their former homes during the solstice. The Vikings took elaborate precautions to protect themselves from the drag or the walking deceased. They believed that an unsealed doorway or a neglected hearth could invite these malevolent spirits inside. The heavy wooden doors were barred and the Onve pillars were inscribed with protective runes to channel ancestral power. The hearthstone itself marked the boundary where human order met the frozen void. Even the livestock in the forest seemed to sense the tension in the air. These animals provided constant metabolic heat that supplemented the fire, but they also required protection from the spectral hunt. The presence of cattle and sheep inside the longhouse was a practical necessity for winter survival, yet it also reinforced the communal bond between all living things within the turf walls. The physics of the building worked in tandem with these spiritual defenses. The massive turf and earth walls possessed enormous thermal mass, absorbing the heat from the hearth during the day and releasing it slowly through the night. This ensured that even if the fire burned down to embers, the interior remained stable and far above the lethal freeze outside. The Vikings had learned through generations of observation that the ground beneath their feet held heat. They built their homes partially sunken into the earth to exploit this natural insulation. By sinking the floor level below the surrounding terrain, they tapped into a geothermal zone that stayed near 50 degrees even when the surface was frozen solid. This helped the longhouse function as a thermal battery that buffered the inhabitants from the violent swings of the Arctic climate. As the Jol feast continued, the chieftain would lead the community in toasts meant to ward off the darkness. They drank ale not just for nourishment, but to satisfy the spiritual requirements of the season. The law of the land demanded this communal participation. To be alone during the solstice was to be vulnerable to the hunt. The social structure of the Vikings was physically encoded into the layout of the longhouse. The chieftain occupied the high seat near the fire, while his followers sat on the benches that lined the walls. This arrangement ensured that everyone was positioned in the warmest zone of the hall, directly in line with the radiant heat of the hearthstones. The community was integrated into a single thermal and social engine where no heat and no person was wasted. The survival paradox remained constant. The minimal ventilation required to keep the hall warm also trapped the combustion byproducts of the fire. Skeletal remains from this period show evidence of chronic respiratory damage caused by living in a perpetual haze of wood smoke. The Vikings understood the trade-off intimately. They chose the risks of the smoke over the certainty of the cold. The smoke layer was a visible reminder of the thin margin for error in the North Atlantic. If the Leori opening was blocked by drifting snow, the hall would become unbreathable in minutes. They had to carefully manage the smoke hole to prevent downdrafts while allowing gases to escape. This was an engineering challenge that required constant attention and a deep understanding of air pressure and buoyancy. The terror of the Oscaria served a practical purpose in this survival strategy. It kept people inside their well-insulated shelters during the nights when the external temperature reached its most lethal levels. No one would dare to venture out into a -30-degree storm when they believed the gods were hunting in the clouds. The spiritual narrative reinforced the architectural necessity of staying within the thermal envelope of the turf walls. The hearth fire became the central symbol of their defiance. It was a controlled flame holding back the frozen void. As long as the fire burned and the stones radiated heat, the family was safe from both the physical and the spectral predators of the winter. They were a people who had learned to collaborate with their environment using soil, stone and fire to create a space for human life to persist. The Jol log in the hearth slowly crumbled into glowing coals as the night progressed. The thermal energy was now stored deep within the heavy stones of the pit. This radiant warmth would carry them through until the first light of the short winter day. They were waiting for the moment when the sun would begin its slow return to the horizon. But before that could happen, they had to endure the night of the Droga. This was the time when the boundaries of the world were most fragile. They looked to their ancestors for protection, believing that the lineage of the family was tied to the very stones of the hearth. The Longhouse was not just a machine for living, but a container for the history and the future of the clan. The spectral dangers outside were a reminder that their place in the universe was never guaranteed. It was earned every night through the smart application of heat management and communal discipline. The night of the Draga was the most terrifying threshold of the winter, because it represented the return of the dead to the places they once inhabited. The Vikings believed that during the winter solstice, the boundary between the living and the deceased was at its thinnest point. To protect the household, they relied on more than just spiritual wards. They used the very architecture of the Longhouse as a physical barrier against the malevolent spirits. The massive turf walls, often stacked to a thickness of over a meter, provided a sense of impenetrable security against the unseen. These walls were not just for insulation, they were the first line of defense against the freezing void and the entities that dwelled within it. Inside, the family remained clustered around the central hearth, which served as a consecrated anchor for their safety. The hearth was built with flat stones that had been absorbing heat all day, and even as the fire smoldered, these stones released a steady, radiant warmth. This radiant heat was essential, because it provided a consistent environment that was easier to manage than the wild swings of an open flame. The Vikings understood that heat moves from areas of higher concentration to lower ones, and the cold winter sky acted as a vacuum, always trying to pull the warmth away. By wrapping their fire in stone and their hole in thick earth, they created a thermal battery that resisted this drain. The high ceiling allowed smoke to rise and collect in a dense layer just beneath the roof, which ironically served to protect the living below. This smoke layer acted as an insulating blanket, trapping the warmer air in the lower zones where the family huddled. The fear of the Draga dictated that every opening be meticulously managed. The wind eyes or vindala were small gaps near the ridgeline that allowed just enough smoke to escape without letting in the killing cold or the spirits of the night. The heavy wooden doors were often barred with timber, and the threshold was treated with ritual care. To the Norse, the doorway was a portal that had to be guarded. The raised wooden benches or palla kept the sleepers elevated above the coldest air that pulled on the dirt floor. By sleeping in the middle layer of the hall, the family was positioned in the warmest available air, directly in line with the radiant energy of the hearthstones. This thermal zoning was not just for comfort, it was a calculated design to ensure that the body heat of the family and their guests remained concentrated. During these nights, the livestock in the Furhus section of the Longhouse provided a vital biological contribution to the home's warmth. These animals acted as living radiators, generating constant metabolic heat that supplemented the dying fire. The presence of cattle and sheep inside the structure was a form of biothermal integration, where every living thing contributed to the thermal budget of the dwelling. This shared body heat was a form of infrastructure that required no extra fuel besides the feed gathered during the summer. As the wind roared outside, the sounds of the animals breathing heavily in the darkness offered a psychological comfort to the family, a sign that the biological cycle of life was still intact within the turf walls. The trade-off for this safety was the constant exposure to smoke and combustion gases. The minimal ventilation required to maintain the insulating smoke layer meant that the inhabitants lived in a perpetual haze. This exposure resulted in chronic respiratory issues, but in a world where the external temperature could drop to 30 below, the choice was clear. The Vikings accepted the smoke because the alternative was the certain death of the frozen void. They were a people who prioritized sufficiency and survival over modern notions of luxury. Their architecture was an adaptive design that did not fight the environment but worked within its harsh realities. As the night of the Draga reached its deepest point, the chieftain and his kin remained vigilant. They knew that the fire had to be maintained, not just for the heat but for the order it represented. The hearth fire was the symbol of human agency in a world that often seemed indifferent to their existence. They relied on the engineering of their ancestors, trusting in the dimensions of the hall and the placement of the stones to keep them alive. This was a system refined through generations of trial and error, a synthesis of earth, wood, stone, and fire. As long as the stones held their heat and the turf walls resisted the wind, the family could survive even the most terrifying spiritual and physical threats of the solstice. The sun was still distant, but within the walls of the long house, the hope of its return was kept alive by the steady, radiant glow of the hearth. The chieftain's responsibility during the solstice was a heavy burden that extended far beyond the ritual toasts. In the larger long houses, which could stretch up to 75 meters in length, the Jarl was expected to provide a feast that demonstrated his ability to command the resources of the landscape. This display of wealth was essential to maintain the social contract that bound his followers and kin to his service. The hearth in his hall was not just a source of warmth, but a symbol of his power and his duty to protect the community from the killing cold. He managed a massive thermal budget that required the careful coordination of fuel, food, and biological heat. In the mainland, where timber was abundant, he might burn massive oak logs, but in the timber-starved regions of Iceland, he relied on the insulating power of turf walls over a meter thick to keep his people alive. Inside the Jarl's hall, the social hierarchy was physically manifested through the thermal zoning of the structure. The chieftain occupied the high seat near the central fire, which was the axis around which the entire social and ritual life revolved. His most trusted warriors and guests sat on the raised wooden platforms called palla that ran the length of the inner walls. These platforms positioned the elite in the warmest available air, directly in line with the radiant heat from the central hearth and just below the insulating smoke layer. Meanwhile, the lower status laborers and slaves worked near the packed dirt floor, which was the coldest zone in the structure where the dense frigid air settled. This arrangement ensured that the community's most vital members were prioritized in the thermal hierarchy. The feast itself was fueled by a diet rich in fats to stoke the internal furnaces of the participants. The Jarl provided massive quantities of meat, focusing on the fattiest parts such as tongue, liver, and bone marrow to provide the high-octane energy needed for survival. This was a calculated nutritional strategy because the human body burns calories at an accelerated rate in extreme cold just to stay warm. The chieftain also oversaw the distribution of pemmican, a concentrated superfood made of dried meat and rendered fat that could sustain a man for days. By providing these calorie-dense resources, the Jarl fulfilled his role as the provider, ensuring that his people had the biological fuel to match the physical heat of the hearth. Beyond the food and fire, the Jarl's hall incorporated the metabolic heat of livestock to supplement the thermal budget. A section of the longhouse called the hearth was reserved for cattle, sheep, and goats, which acted as living radiators. These animals generated continuous body heat that was captured by the heavily insulated turf envelope of the house. The chieftain understood that this biothermal integration was essential in an environment where firewood was scarce. The animals required no fuel beyond the feed gathered in the summer, and their constant warmth helped stabilize the interior temperature even when the central fire burned low during the coldest hours of the night. The Jarl's responsibility also included managing the air quality within the crowded hall. There were no chimneys, so smoke from the multiple cooking fires rose to collect in a dense layer beneath the roof. The chieftain's builders managed this through the Leori smoke hole and small gaps called wind eyes, which allowed just enough ventilation to keep the hall breathable without losing the precious warmth. This created a perpetual haze that blackened the beams and stung the eyes, but it was the price of survival in the North Atlantic. The Jarl's Hall was a machine for living, a synthetic system of stone, earth, animals, and fire that required constant discipline and observation to maintain. As the Jarl feast reached its peak, the chieftain would lead the community in rituals that reinforced their shared identity. The hearthstone itself was often passed down through generations, serving as a physical anchor to the land and the lineage. When a family moved, the hearthstones were sometimes left behind as a testament to their history. The Jarl was the guardian of this continuity, the one who ensured that the fire of his ancestors never went out. His hall was not just a shelter from the storm, but a consecrated space where the memory of the clan was preserved against the frozen void of the winter. The transition from the ancient Joel to a new era began with the Great Merging led by King Haakon the Good. He was a ruler who understood that he could not simply erase the thermal and social traditions that had kept his people alive for centuries. Instead, he decreed that the traditional midwinter Joel feast should be held at the same time as the Christian celebration of Christmas. This was a calculated political move that recognized the cultural weight of the hearth and the hall. The physical reality of the longhouse remained unchanged because the laws of physics do not shift with religion. Families still huddled around the central hearth, relying on the same stone and turf engineering to survive the killing cold that plunged to 30 degrees below zero. The stones in the fire pit continued to act as a thermal battery, absorbing energy during the day to radiate it back into the hall through the long night. The survival engine of the North was too vital to be discarded, so the rituals of the cross were layered over the rituals of the log. King Haakon's decree mandated that every man must brew ale from a certain amount of grain or face heavy fines. This ensured that the liquid fuel of the North continued to play its role in the social and biological survival of the community. While the toasts were now offered in the name of the new faith, the act of drinking together around the fire served the same communal purpose it always had. The longhouse continued to function as a machine for recycling heat, with its thick walls of earth and sod providing the thermal inertia needed to stabilize the interior temperature. The biological heat from livestock in the feast section still supplemented the fire, maintaining a microclimate that was far above the lethal freeze outside. This biothermal integration remained a cornerstone of their existence because no amount of spiritual change could replace the metabolic warmth of a living radiator. The architecture of the hall continued to enforce the social order even as the meaning of the celebrations evolved. The chieftain or local leader still occupied the high seat near the fire, flanked by the protective Onve Sula pillars. The raised wooden platforms kept the elite in the warmest layer of air, while the smoke collected in an insulating blanket above their heads. The trade-off between warmth and air quality persisted, as the minimal ventilation required to hold back the cold continued to trap combustion gases. Archaeological studies of skeletal remains from this transition period still show the chronic respiratory damage caused by a life spent in the haze of the hearth. The Vikings and their descendants accepted this survival paradox because the smoke remained the price of staying alive in an environment that showed no mercy. As the Great Merging progressed, the traditional Joel log remained a central feature of the winter months. It provided the thermal mass required to keep the stone hearth functioning as a radiant heater for hours on end. The settlers understood that their ships and their weapons were essential, but the technology of the longhouse was what allowed human life to persist across the North Atlantic. They had encoded their understanding of heat movement, air buoyancy, and material insulation into every turf block and stone they laid. By merging the old feast with the new holiday, Haakon ensured that the practical wisdom of the ancestors was preserved. The longhouse was more than a relic of a pagan past. It was a demonstration of human adaptability that would continue to shelter families for generations to come. Even as the spiritual landscape changed, the physical reality of the sub-zero winter ensured that the hearth would always be the axis around which their lives revolved. The echoes of these ancient survival strategies remain in the very hearth of our modern celebrations. What we now call the Christmas tree, the holiday ham and the Yule log, are direct remnants of a time when the longhouse was a thermal machine engineered to trap, recycle, and generate heat from every available source. The Vikings built their homes without blueprints or formal education in physics, yet they encoded a sophisticated understanding of heat movement and air management into every structure. They understood that the ground beneath their feet held heat, and that stones could act as a battery, absorbing warmth to release it slowly through the night. The principles of thermal mass and passive insulation they mastered with stone, turf, and fire are the same constants that govern modern sustainable design. The legacy of the Viking Joel is a testament to human adaptability in one of the harshest climates on Earth. They did not try to conquer winter, but accommodated it by building structures that worked within the reality of the cold. Every element of the longhouse, from the livestock providing biological heat, to to the raised benches positioning families in the warmest air, reinforced a holistic system of survival. While the longhouses eventually fell out of use as modern materials like concrete and steel became available, the fundamental challenge remains the same: how to create a stable, livable interior against a hostile exterior. The story of the Viking winter is not one of luxury but of sufficiency, of generating enough warmth to survive the night and ensure the continuity of the lineage. Snow still falls on the ruins of longhouses across Scandinavia and Iceland, where the turf has eroded and the timber has rotted, but the proof of their ingenuity remains. The hearthstones, worn smooth by centuries of use, stand as a physical anchor to a people who refused to surrender to the cold. They observed how heat moved, how smoke behaved, and how materials insulated, and they passed that knowledge down through generations. Today, as we gather by our own fires to share stories, we are participating in a ritual of community and warmth that stretches back 1,000 years. The Viking longhouse was a survival tool as essential as a ship, a masterpiece of engineering that allowed human life to persist when there was no margin for error. It reminds us that intelligence is measured by the effectiveness of the solutions we produce with the resources at hand.